Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this video, which has been very kindly sponsored by REC Watches. 85 years ago, Britain was under threat from the German Luftwaffe, and although it felt like Britain was standing alone, that wasn't entirely true. Pat Hughes was one of the non-British pilots in the RAF helping to defend British skies. He'd actually joined up to the RAF before the war, and by the height of the Battle of Britain, his unit had transferred from Cornwall, where it had started the conflict, over to defending the fields of southeast England. Flying Spitfire X4009, he racked up victory after victory in locations so familiar and close to me I can drive to many of them in under 15 minutes. But one day he seems to have rammed a Dornier 17 and his parachute failed to work after he bailed out of his stricken aircraft. Hughes was recovered and laid to rest, and his Spitfire was also buried where it crashed. However, fast forward to the 21st century, and X4009 has been recovered and is in the process of being rebuilt, hopefully to fly again one day. So what's this all got to do with watches, I hear you ask? Well, portions of the airframe are non-repairable, and REC have incorporated some of that material into their X4009 series of watches. Part of the proceeds from each sale will go towards helping to restore X4009 to the skies. So if you'd like to take advantage of that, please see the link in the description below, and you can use the code DRACH, that's D-R-A-C-H, to get an extra discount if you choose to order one of those watches. So thanks to REC, and now another battle with Australian involvement. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been on something of a roll, facilitating the Japanese advance throughout the Southwest Pacific to great success. There had been small reverses here and there. Minor engagements by Allied destroyers had shown that the Japanese didn't have a monopoly on night actions. US carrier raids had shown that the US Pacific Fleet wasn't entirely out of the fight after the December 7th attack on their home port, and there had of course been a few warships damaged or lost to various causes. But overall, the bill was very much in the Imperial Japanese Navy's favour. Far more Allied shipping, both mercantile and naval, was now on the ocean floor or hightailing it for yet another fallback position. The US Navy's battle line would take years to recover. The US Asiatic Squadron was but a distant memory. The Dutch fleet protecting the vital oil fields in the Dutch East Indies had been smashed. The British China station had either been wiped out, forced into retreat. The bastion of Singapore had been taken. The Eastern Fleet had been forced to retreat to the other side of the Indian Ocean, and the hastily thrown together ABDA command had been swept aside with the majority of its fleet sunk or badly damaged. But as they approached April 1942, the list of places the pre-war Japanese plans had called for them to occupy was getting smaller and smaller by the day. They almost reached the edges of their pre-planned Pacific defense perimeter, and now they could start to dig in and fortify to break any counterattack. Granted, there were massive ongoing land campaigns in China and Burma, but these were both not the Imperial Japanese Navy's concern, and even in the wider scope of things, they had very little to do with the maritime defensive cordon that was designed to prevent enemy counterattack at sea, particularly, of course, American. And so thoughts turned to securing the outer edges of this cordon, a few islands here and there that had yet to have the banner of the rising sun flown over them, as well as bypassing a few pockets of enemy holdouts. One big item of debate, though, was what to do with Australia. Some Japanese officers advocated launching an invasion of the northern coast of the small continent. Interestingly, this proposal came largely from the Navy, who reckoned that the Allies would use Australia as a base for a counter-offensive. Their first proposal was therefore to get there first and invade the northern Australian coast, occupying anything and everything of value, roughly from Exmouth on the northwest corner all the way around to the wonderfully named Magnetic Island on the northeast coast, although exactly where to start and where to stop the Japanese proposed line of control varied somewhat as discussions went on. Later on, this proposal was extended to propose the occupation of the entirety of the eastern coast as well, particularly Brisbane and Sydney, as these had much larger ports, shipbuilding facilities and populations than anything on the northern coast of Australia, and would naturally therefore not only be of the greatest use to the Imperial Japanese Navy, but also, if left alone, they'd be the most likely ingress and basing points for an Allied counteroffensive, again particularly coming from America. But the Imperial Japanese Army rejected these ideas, and for once it wasn't just because it was the Imperial Japanese Navy who was proposing them. They pointed out that the Navy's estimates for how many troops would be needed to occupy their targets, less than 50,000, was laughably undersized, and instead they reckoned that they would need hundreds of thousands of troops at a minimum, possibly more than had been committed to the entirety of the maritime side of the expansion effort thus far. They anticipated high losses fighting the locals, and that was before any of the Australian Army got involved. Instead, it was decided to dust off and update one of the many plans that had been drawn up pre-war. This was titled Operation M.O. This was to be divided into 4 separate operational forces. Firstly, a small force with 4 small destroyers and 2 auxiliaries as escort would take the island of Tulagi. Then, in theory, they would follow on to Nauru and Ocean Islands if Mo succeeded. And while they waited for that, they would build a seaplane base on Tulagi, as they brought a seaplane tender with them. Secondly, the primary invasion force, which would head for Port Moresby, the capital of New Guinea, bypassing a long overland campaign by the Imperial Japanese Army which would otherwise be necessary to reach it, as the city was on the southeast side of the massive island, while the Japanese army was still slowly making its way through the northern side of the same island. This would have as escort half a dozen older destroyers, the light cruiser Yubari, and various auxiliaries. Third, in direct support of the landing force would be a heavy escort consisting of the light carrier Shoho, 4 older heavy cruisers, 2 older light cruisers, and a single destroyer, the Sazanabe. And fourth, a heavy support force to act against possible Allied massed air attack or interference from the carrier USS Yorktown, which the Japanese suspected of being in the area. This force comprised the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, partially as this should be more than enough to deal with a single US carrier, and partially because the rest of the Kurabutai was otherwise occupied, either heading home for refit after the Indian Ocean raid, or in Kaga's case, still under repair after grounding. Their escort would be 2 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers, plus assorted auxiliaries. Also on standby was the 25th Air Fleet, with almost 150 aircraft roughly split evenly between fighters and bombers. All in all, it was a pretty decent plan based on what was known of Allied strength in this region. However, Allied counterintelligence was already in the process of invalidating that knowledge. Several important Japanese naval codes had already been broken, and US and British codebreakers managed to decipher separate transmissions about significant naval assets being moved into the operational area of the Japanese Fourth Fleet, under the overall command of Vice Admiral Inoue, with the British concluding that Port Moresby was the likely target of these operations. All of the information from both sets of codebreakers was passed on to Admiral Nimitz, who combined all the messages to give a clearer picture of what was about to unfold, and agreed with the assessment. But he noticed a golden opportunity. A lot of Japanese Navy forces had been distracted by the recently executed Doolittle raid. This allowed a narrow window in which the Japanese forces would have only 2 fleet and 1 light carrier to hand in the area, but if he could move fast enough, the US Navy could counter the Japanese advance with the entire available Pacific Fleet carrier strength, the big ex-battlecruiser Lexington, and all 3 of the Yorktown class. From this potential battle roster, the Japanese had been correct that Yorktown was already in the area, as the centerpiece of Task Force 17 under Admiral Fletcher. Task Force 11, centered on the USS Lexington, was somewhat to the east, but could head over to join Fletcher pretty quickly. But Task Force 16, under Admiral Halsey, had only just rocked up at Pearl Harbor after the aforementioned Doolittle raid, and so they'd need to be quickly refueled, restocked, and then sent southwest to join up with the others. The orders for all of this were issued on the 29th of April, and the 4 carriers and their escorts began heading for their rendezvous. The various Japanese forces had also begun to sail at the end of April and the beginning of May, with 4 large submarines assigned to guard against US forces entering the Coral Sea from the southeast. But Yorktown and Lexington were already past that patrol line by the time they arrived on station, with Task Force 17 and Task Force 11 taking the first days of May to refuel and meet up with another Allied force, this one made up of US and Australian surface units. All told, Fletcher would have at his disposal 2 carriers, 7 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 13 destroyers, and 2 oilers, 1 from each carrier task force. Of these, he would detach the 2 oilers, each with a destroyer as escort, away from the main battle formations. The Neosho went with the Sims and the Tippecanoe with the Warden. The former was to remain in the general area, following the fleet and ready to top off its tanks if needed, while the latter would be delivering any remaining fuel in its tanks to other Allied warships that were not directly involved in this situation and were anchored elsewhere. Enterprise and Hornet were due to arrive somewhere around the 10th, but events were unfolding rapidly. On the 3rd of May, the Tulagi invasion force arrived and began landing its troops. Fletcher intended to maintain the element of surprise by keeping strict radio silence, but that also meant that he was unaware of Lexington's task force finishing their refueling process a little early. So he headed off with just Yorktown and her escorts to hit the Japanese force at Tulagi before they could complete their seaplane base. This strike was mildly successful, sinking 3 minesweepers and fatally damaging the destroyer Kikuzuki, although she was run aground to prevent her sinking, and it would take some time before she finally got the message and slid off the sandbar into deeper water and then sank properly. A similar number of other ships were damaged, but although the Japanese operation was disrupted, it wasn't stopped. In exchange, Yorktown lost 2 Wildcats and a Devastator, all to running out of fuel on their way back, but the air crews survived. Destroyers were able to recover the fighter pilots, but they weren't able to find the torpedo bomber crew, who instead ended up floating to Guadalcanal on their life raft, and from there they would later manage to rejoin friendly forces. Unknown to Fletcher, the Shikaku and Zuikaku were actually in striking range of Tulagi to the north. But thanks to believing that the submarine patrol line would catch any US carriers entering the Coral Sea, Admiral Takagi sent his recon aircraft looking for US forces to the east of the Solomon Islands instead of to the south, and thus missed Fletcher completely. Yorktown now met up with Lexington at the prearranged rendezvous point on the 5th, and prepared to act on the latest intelligence, which indicated the landings at Port Moresby would occur on the 10th. This would force Fletcher to act before Enterprise and Hornet could arrive, and so he topped up his fuel tanks from the Neosho with a plan to attack the Japanese invasion force 3 days before they could land at Port Moresby. The Japanese, meanwhile, were also refueling, and were also anticipating some kind of battle occurring on the 7th. On the 6th, a Japanese reconnaissance flying boat spotted the Yorktown. At this stage, Shikaku and Zuikaku, which were moving toward the landing forces, the same as the US forces but on different courses, were about 300 nautical miles north of the US ships. Although technically in strike range, the Japanese carriers were still refueling themselves, and the cloud base was reported to be low around the US ships. Not wanting to risk a hasty strike that would probably either get lost or possibly even fly right over the enemy without spotting them, Takagi ordered his carriers to close the distance by heading south with a plan to attack at dawn the next day. Meanwhile, over to the west, US Army Air Force B-17s were busy proving Billy Mitchell wrong as they dropped dozens and dozens of tons of bombs in repeated attacks on the Port Moresby invasion force and failed to hit anything. They did, however, manage to spot the carrier Shoho at long range to the east of their primary targets and duly reported her presence, which meant that Fletcher had no idea that Takagi's carriers were closing on him from the north, as he concluded that either they, or at least some form of Japanese carrier force, were in fact operating in close support of the invasion force, which was much further away to the northwest. And so he set out in that direction. Interestingly, this meant that as evening approached, the 2 carrier formations were actually close enough to each other that if they'd both been gifted with larger escort forces, it's possible that outriding destroyers might actually have spotted each other. But with their tighter escort groups and the fall of night, nothing happened and the Japanese carriers turned north again, since their advance south had been with a minimal escort and they didn't want to risk running into the US forces without anything in the way of protection from a nighttime gun action. This, in turn, led to a situation early the following morning where the 3 forces were forming a rough triangle pointing south, with the Port Moresby invasion force to the top left, Takagi's fleet carriers to the top right, and Fletcher's forces down at the bottom, with the US ships moving roughly west-northwest across the face of the other two forces, while the Japanese fleet carriers had turned around and headed back south again, unknowingly heading for a position that was directly east of the US ships. Fletcher believed he was now directly south of the Japanese carriers, and Takagi believed he was directly north of the Americans, which was in fact the positions they'd both been in the day before. Thus, Fletcher elected to send the cruisers Chicago, Australia, and Hobart, along with the destroyers Perkins and Walk, ahead of him to block any attempt to get around New Guinea's eastern tip by the invasion formation, while he dealt with the carriers. At dawn, both sides launched scouts, 10 Dauntlesses from Yorktown and a dozen B-5N Kates from the Japanese formation. Additionally, floatplanes, seaplanes, and bombers from nearby Japanese bases were dispatched to augment their search, and adjacent to the invasion force, some of the cruisers with the Shoho sent out their own scouts. At 0722, the first sighting was made. One of Shogaku's scouts reported sighting a US carrier, a cruiser, and a pair of destroyers almost directly south. This was right where they'd expected to find them. Another nearby aircraft confirmed it could see the same thing, and when word reached Admiral Takagi, he ordered an immediate strike. In just 15 minutes, 36 dive bombers, 24 torpedo bombers, and an escort of 18 Zeros was on its way. As the force headed off and the next wave was fueled and armed, further reports came in. More carriers had been spotted to the west, this time by aircraft that weren't from his carriers. This confused Takagi briefly, as he had multiple reports of a carrier to his south. But it was too late to redirect the strike force to the new contacts, which were some distance away, and in any case he knew that US carriers doctrinally operated in separate formations. So he reasoned that perhaps those formations had become separated, or were trying to join up and had never been combined in the first place. And so he turned his ships to close on the new contacts while ordering the existing strike force to continue. Even as the last aircraft of this first Japanese attack wave had left Shogaku's flight deck, over in the US formation, a report from one of its own scouts reported 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers to the northwest. Fletcher, like Takagi, concluded that this must be his opposite number, and he ordered all ready aircraft to be launched. Since the US didn't at this point believe in strike packages that were made up of smaller groups launched from different carriers and then combining, but rather in getting full deck loads from each ship airborne, it would take a bit longer to get the US aircraft aloft. But eventually, 53 Dauntlesses, 22 Devastators, and 18 Wildcats would be on their way. But while the US carriers were still launching, the Japanese aircraft arrived at their target. It was 0915 and the strike force reported that they had seen a tanker and a destroyer. This was, of course, the Neosho and the Sims. But they didn't see the carrier they'd been promised. Thinking perhaps sighting the tanker meant that there was a carrier nearby and the tanker was following it, they decided to begin a search for it. Dropping back over to the US formation, it was just after 10:15, and the scout aircraft had returned, a few minutes after the last strike aircraft had taken off, only to discover that the scout in question had encoded his message wrong, resulting in a dramatic overestimation of enemy strength. But at almost the same time, B-17s reported 37 ships, including a carrier, about 30 nautical miles to the south of where the scout had reported he had located the enemy 2 hours previously. Believing that this in fact confirmed an enemy carrier formation of some kind was therefore definitely on that bearing, Fletcher directed his strike forces to keep going with the updated target coordinates, as 30 nautical miles in 2 hours, or a speed of advance of about 15 knots, wasn't entirely unbelievable for an invasion force. As it approached 1100, the Japanese pilots orbiting near Neosho and Sims eventually realized their mistake in identification, and Takagi, drawing a line based on the direction that the US ships were heading, realized that the US carrier forces, if they were anywhere, were now somewhere between him and the invasion forces. And so he ordered the Kates and Zeros to save their ammunition and return to their carriers immediately, while the dive bombers would take out the targets that they'd found. Thus, at 11:15, the 36 dive bombers began their one-sided assault. Poor old Sims was hit by 3 out of 4 bombs directed at her, broke in half, and vanished in moments, taking almost all of her crew with her, with scarcely over a dozen left in the water once the smoke had cleared. The Neosho, on the other hand, was still afloat. Granted, she'd been hit by at least 7 bombs, but her large size, combined with the fact she was mostly empty of fuel, meant that although she was sinking slowly, she had enough buoyancy to stay afloat for some time yet. She was, however, on fire, in part thanks to having managed to shoot down one of the dive bombers, which had then promptly crashed into her. About half the crew thought that this meant she was about to sink and had abandoned ship. Most would never be seen again, while the remainder, including the survivors from the Sims, were doing their best to save the ship, or at the very least put off her eventual fate for as long as possible. While this had been going on, the US strike aircraft had spotted Shoho with a mighty 6-strong combat air patrol. Unsurprisingly, the light carrier was then subjected to a brutal beatdown as over a dozen bombs and more than half a dozen torpedoes slammed into her. Aircraft losses on both sides turned out to be about equal. 3 combat air patrol fighters were downed by the Wildcats, and 3 Dauntlesses were shot down by Japanese anti-aircraft fire, as the 4 cruisers accompanying Shoho, plus the carrier's own gunners, did their best to defend her. Famously, one of Lexington's pilots signalled, "Scratch 1 flat top." What wasn't surprising was that Shoho was doomed. The surprising part was that it took her almost an hour to sink after the first hit, given just how much damage she absorbed, but sink she did, taking about 3/4 of her crew and all her aircraft with her, the 3 combat air patrol survivors being the only aircraft still around, and without a carrier to land on, they had to ditch near some occupied islands and swim ashore. About an hour after Shoho was sunk, a Japanese seaplane reported the detached cruiser formation that was blocking the invasion convoy's advance, but once again, the scouts got it wrong, reporting that it consisted of 2 carriers and their escorts. Takagi, who'd also been informed that US carrier aircraft had just blown Shoho out of the water, consulted his maps and concluded that this apparent carrier formation was well out of range of his strike aircraft. Instead, he advised Admiral Inoue, who was back at Rabaul, that he could only attack that formation the next day. In actual fact, he was in easy strike range of Fletcher's real position, but he didn't know that. Thus, the invasion convoy was ordered to temporarily turn back north for its own safety, with its surface escorts to remain south of it, ready to be called in for a nighttime surface action. To soften up the enemy formation for Takagi, almost 3 dozen bombers loaded with a mixture of bombs and torpedoes were directed to attack that afternoon. Thus, shortly after the US strike aircraft had made it back to their own carriers and were rearming to attack the invasion convoy, reports came in from the cruiser force stating that they'd come under heavy air attack and they were without any air support of their own. Luckily, the cruisers and their escorting destroyers emerged with little damage beyond a few splinter hits from near misses, despite a flight of B-17 showing up at the tail end of the attack and trying to bomb the Allied ships as well. They claimed that they'd mistaken the G-3M and G-4M Japanese aircraft for B-25 or B-26 American bombers, and then concluded that, well, if other friendly aircraft were attacking something, then the B-17s should join in as well. Luckily, their track record of just churning up the ocean remained unbroken. In exchange for the loss of 4 Japanese bombers to anti-aircraft fire, and another one so badly shot up that it crash-landed, the Japanese pilots claimed to have sunk a major target. But the apparent carriers from the Scouts report now morphed into battleships in the strike aircraft's report, as their close approaches had revealed rather more gun turrets than would typically be found on a carrier. They also claimed that another battleship, and potentially a cruiser, had been badly damaged. Although these claims were wildly exaggerated in both scope and effectiveness, the cruisers who had been attacked reported it had been a rather close-run thing, and they would need to withdraw somewhat to get out of range of Japanese land-based bombers, although they intended to still remain close enough to make a run on the invasion convoy if it showed up. Meanwhile, Fletcher concluded from the reports of his strike pilots, who'd gone considerably closer to Shoho than any of the Scouts, that the carrier they'd attacked was both alone and, relatively speaking, small. That meant the enemy fleet carriers were still out there somewhere unmolested. So he cancelled any further attacks on the invasion convoy and instead focused on getting a strong combat air patrol up in case the enemy carrier aircraft appeared. He did consider going looking for them, but as it was approaching 3 o'clock, he decided that even if the enemy ships were found, it would be far too late in the day by the time they were to launch a strike, and so the bomber pilots were stood down. But there was one last element to play out. Another Japanese scout aircraft spotted the cruiser force heading south and got the course estimation wrong, claiming that they were actually heading southeast. Since the reports from the land-based bombers didn't seem to have reached Takagi yet, or if they had, they'd been set aside, he still thought that this was a carrier formation, and if the course heading was true, it was heading right for him. So he chanced to strike with just over 24 of his best dive and torpedo bomber crews, hoping to achieve surprise at the close of the day. The reason the best crews were chosen was because they'd have to return after sunset and land in the dark. These aircraft were dispatched heading almost directly west. Just before 6 o'clock in the evening, the radar operators of Fletcher's forces picked up incoming contacts. It was the Japanese strike aircraft who were unknowingly heading right for the American carriers. 11 Combat Air Patrol Wildcats were quickly sent in, and without escorts and not expecting to encounter enemy aircraft at this stage in their flight, the Japanese bombers were hit by surprise. 7 of the Kates and a Val were shot down, and another Kate was critically damaged. Although the crews did prove their elite status by taking 2 of the F-4Fs with them and disorienting a third enough that he couldn't work out which way home was, which resulted in the aircraft crashing. But the cost was still very high, with several senior squadron officers lost in the melee. With the sun then setting at 6:30, everyone was now carefully feeling their way home, and there was a brief moment of almost deadly hilarity when some Japanese dive bombers, having ditched their bombs to get greater range to head back to their carriers, spotted the US carriers and in the failing light tried to land on them, only to be dissuaded by last-minute anti-aircraft fire. The first time either of the two sides' fleet carrier air groups had actually seen the other side's carriers for real. As the stars shone down, both sides took stock. Neither side's scouts had proven to be in any way accurate, and both sides had ended up attacking enemy forces thinking that they were the other side's fleet carriers and ended up being completely wrong. But overall, the Americans had claimed a light carrier and delayed the invasion force in exchange for the loss of 3 Dauntlesses and 3 Wildcats. Conversely, the Japanese had cut off the US fuel supply by sinking the Neosho, as well as they claiming the Sims, but in addition to the G4Ms and Shoho's air complement, they'd also lost a number of their best air crews in that last-minute evening strike attempt. For his part, Fletcher elected to head west to further cut off the invasion convoy route, but he prepared to launch a full 360-degree search pattern the following day for the enemy carriers. Takagi moved north, unintentionally re-establishing the approximate triangle of forces, but with a much narrower base. This would limit the arc of search that he'd have to do the following morning, while also getting him closer to the invasion convoy, allowing for mutual support between the surface escorts. On both sides, the exhausted pilots tried to grab some sleep before the pre-dawn call would bring them back into the cockpit. And so, on the morning of the 8th of May, it all began again. A mixture of Kates, H-6K flying boats, and G4M bombers fanned out to look for the US carriers, while 18 Dauntlesses looked for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The weather had moved north. The low clouds were now over the Japanese ships, while the US ships were operating under clear skies. At around 0820, both sides reported each other at almost the same time. The formations were about 210 nautical miles apart, and the race was on. Both carrier formations turned toward each other at speed to allow for faster recovery of their strike aircraft, although this unintentionally moved the Japanese carriers into range of the US Devastator torpedo bombers. About an hour later, 3 formations were in the air. The Japanese combined formation of 18 Zeros, 22 Vals, and a reduced force of 18 Kates. This in part due to the losses from the night before, and in part due to a number of Kates still being out on scouting duty. Realizing that speed really was of the essence, the US carriers launched partial instead of full deck loads, and both air groups proceeded independently of each other, with 6 Wildcats, 24 Dauntlesses, and 9 Devastators flying from Yorktown, and 9 Wildcats, 15 Dauntlesses, and 12 Devastators coming from the Lexington. The first to arrive over the enemy was Yorktown's Dauntless dive bombers, spotting Shokaku just after 10:30. But they'd outpaced the Devastators, so they waited out of anti-aircraft gun range to allow both forces to attack at once. This would split enemy fire, and hopefully the combat air patrol as well. The combined forces then headed into the attack just before 11 o'clock, facing off against 16 Zeros on combat air patrol. In exchange for 2 Dauntlesses shot down, the Yorktown's air groups claimed 2 Zeros shot down and 2 1,000-pound bomb hits on Shokaku. Unfortunately, all the Devastator's Mark 13 torpedoes either missed or failed to function properly. At about the same time, the Japanese strike force showed up near the US carriers. The US Combat Air Patrol was made up of a mix of Wildcats and Dauntlesses, as the latter could at least go after the Japanese bombers, and they could remain on station for considerably longer. Since the Kates didn't actually go low until they were just about to make their attack run, they bypassed the first line of combat air patrol fighters, which had gone low in anticipation of intercepting them. And then the Japanese attack began. 4 Kates went after the Yorktown, which evaded all of their strikes. The other 14 went after the Lexington in a pincer attack. The remaining combat air patrol took out 4 of them in exchange for the loss of 4 Dauntlesses taken out by the escorting Zeros. Then another 4 Kates fell to the fleet's combined anti-aircraft fire. But the remaining torpedo bombers managed to land 2 hits on the Lexington, the first of which would be critical as it cracked the portside aviation gas tanks and fumes started to spread unseen. Meanwhile, the Vals split their attentions. 19 went after Lexington and 14 went after Yorktown. The combat air patrol did their best, but the Zeros escorting the Vals were very good, and they managed to prevent anyone hitting or disrupting the Lexington-bound bombers, although a pair of Wildcats did manage to throw some of Yorktown's attackers off their game. As a result, the embattled Lexington was the one that took more damage. 2 direct hits and several close near misses rained down, setting a number of fires on board. Yorktown took a single hit and numerous near misses, which caused enough damage to force her to slow down. Lexington had already been slowed by the second torpedo hit. The Japanese lost 2 of their Val dive bombers in exchange for this damage. As the Japanese aircraft headed back, the scattered US Combat Air Patrol pursued. Another Val, 3 Kates, and a Zero were then lost in exchange for another 3 Dauntlesses and 3 Wildcats. On their way back, the Japanese ran into US aircraft who were coming back from their own strikes, and one of the scouting Kates, as well as the commander of the Val dive bombers, were shot down in passing dogfights. Even as the Japanese strike headed back out to sea, the Lexington's air group had arrived over the Japanese carriers, but cloud cover meant that only 4 of the Dauntless pilots could actually see their targets, 2 going after each carrier, resulting in 1 further hit on the Shokaku. The Devastators had more luck finding their target, but no luck in scoring any hits. The Wildcats managed to protect their charges from the combat air patrol of Zeros at the cost of 3 of their own shot down. Both sides now recovered their aircraft and began to total up their losses, but still more aircraft were going into the sea as some got lost, others succumbed to battle damage or lack of fuel, and still others made it to the carriers but crash-landed, and still more managed to make good landings but were then judged to be too badly damaged to be worth repairing. And on both sides, 1 carrier was recovering what was left of 2 air groups, Zuikaku recovering Shokaku's air group in addition to her own, and many of Lexington's aircraft landing on Yorktown. By mid-afternoon, Fletcher judged that since reports now indicated that only 1 of the enemy carriers had been damaged, and his own air groups were not just reduced but had suffered significant degradation of their combat air patrol and Wildcat complements, along with having both of his own carriers damaged, it was probably best to withdraw for the moment. Aboard Takagi's ships, it was almost the other way round. His pilots were convinced that both American ships were mortally wounded or potentially already sunk, and although Shokaku had had to withdraw to cope with her battle damage, Zuikaku was still fully operational. But the air group was a different matter. Even as technicians worked to patch up damaged aircraft, Although they could report a healthy, if diminished, 24 Zeros were ready for immediate action, there were only a dozen strike aircraft, total, two-thirds of them dive bombers, immediately operational. But without an enemy carrier threat, this wasn't an immediate concern. His most pressing concern was actually fuel levels, as the last couple of days of constant high-speed dashes had depleted his escort's tanks. The lack of operational strike aircraft did present one problem, though. The scouts had finally figured out that the detached cruiser formation was in fact a surface action group and not yet another set of carriers, and Takagi just didn't have enough aircraft to meaningfully deal with them. Rather than risk the invasion force in a surface action without meaningful air cover, it was decided to recall it and instead redirect its efforts to the phosphate-rich islands of Nauru and Ocean Island, the follow-up targets for the Tulagi branch of the operation. But as mid-afternoon progressed onwards, Fletcher was facing a major dilemma. Although the initial fires aboard Lexington had been contained, stray sparks had then set off a gasoline fuel explosion shortly before 1 in the afternoon. Now, just before 14:45, another massive explosion rocked the ship. Both explosions had left large fires in their wake, and despite their best efforts, another explosion just before 15:30 set yet another major fire, and soon Lexington's crew reluctantly concluded they no longer had the resources to contain them. And so just after 1700, abandoned ship was ordered, and over 90% of the ship's crew would subsequently be rescued, plus about half the surviving air group which had landed aboard Yorktown. With the Lexington settling, but not yet underwater, the destroyer Phelps tried to finish the ship off with a spread of 5 torpedoes, but, this being the early stages of the Pacific Campaign, at least 2 of them failed to detonate. Nonetheless, some damage was done, and the Lexington sank just before 8 p.m. Later that night, Admiral Yamamoto ordered the invasion force to turn around again and head back for Port Moresby, and Takagi to finish off the US ships. After refueling, Takagi's forces searched for but failed to locate Fletcher's forces on the 10th, as by that point the US ships had left the Coral Sea, although Enterprise and Hornet had just arrived in the general vicinity. However, Admiral Inoue disobeyed Yamamoto's orders and didn't actually tell the invasion force to head back to Port Moresby, which may have contributed to his being relieved of command later in the year. Meanwhile, Admiral Crace, in command of the cruiser group, was left with no information on what was actually going on, and so, after a few days, on the 10th, he decided, in the absence of anything happening at all, that everyone else must have already gone home, so he headed for Australia. 2 final acts would wrap up the battle. On the 11th, a Catalina spotted the drifting, waterlogged, but still somehow afloat Neosho, and the destroyer USS Henley headed over to rescue the remaining crew and the few survivors from the Sims who were still aboard, before dispatching the slowly dying tanker with gunfire. And then, after having scared off any immediate Japanese attempts on Nauru with the presence of the Enterprise and Hornet, the 2 newly arrived US carriers hightailed it back to Pearl Harbor, chasing after Yorktown, who'd headed there a bit more directly. All 3 carriers were being recalled, for although the Shikakus would be out of action for some time while one of them was repaired and both of them had their air groups rebuilt, the other 4 Japanese fleet carriers were preparing to head for the island of Midway, and the 3 Yorktowns would soon be fighting side by side over that small island.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.